Hello and welcome. What happens when the world gives you everything and it still doesn't feel like enough? He had the looks, the voice, the fame, sold out stadiums, diamond records, screaming fans across the globe. But behind the sunglasses, behind the smile, something else was going on. Something darker, something no chart could measure. This is not just a story about music, it's about identity, obsession, silence, and the man who tried to disappear at the very height of his success. You know the songs, you definitely heard Last Christmas, you've cried to Careless Whisper, but do you really know the man who wrote them? Today we're going back, way back, to where it all began. Because to understand George Michael, we have to start long before the spotlight. So, George Michael. Let me take you back to a place called Finchley, a small district tucked away in North London. These days, it's the kind of neighborhood where you find cozy coffee shops, leafy parks, bike paths, even tennis courts. But back in early 60s, completely different story. At the time, Finchley was a modest working-class area, home to mostly to immigrants and laborers chasing their beginnings in the big city. Some had stayed after the war, others, well, they were simply dreaming of building a better life. Among those hopeful newcomers was a Greek Cypriot man named Kyriakos Panayotou. In England, he went by Jack. Now picture Jack, working long, punishing hours in London restaurants. He started off washing dishes, moved up to waiting tables, and eventually landed a gig as assistant manager. It wasn't glamorous and he earned next to nothing. But Jack believed, really believed, that one day he would make it, own his own place, provide something lasting for his family. And speaking of family, he wasn't in it alone. His wife, Leslie, and their two little daughters, Yoda and Melanie, stood by him through it all. The Panayotou family wasn't just admired, they were loved in Finchley. They were tiny, always kind, always smiling, and the girls? Adorable. Neighbors would stop just to say hello when the family strolled by. Everyone noticed how tirelessly Jack worked, and they respected him for it. Then, in 1962, a joyful surprise. Leslie was expecting again. Jack, he dreamed of having a son, someone who might one day take over his future business, carry the family name with pride. And wouldn't you know it, their wish came true. On 25th June 1963, a dark-haired baby was born. They named him Georgios Kyriakos Panayotou. And yes, you know where this is going. This little boy would one day become George Michael. And well, from now on, let's stick with George. And later he would drop his surname and change it, but we'll get to that part soon enough. So little George became the third Panayotou child with another mouth to feed. Jack worked even harder. He was barely home. That meant George was mostly raised by Leslie and his sister. His world from the very start was full of warmth, love, and the gentle energy of strong women. By the time he was 3, George had a thing for nature. Like, seriously, he would bring home flowers, bugs, spiders. Yeah, spiders. He would sit for hours examining them with a magnifying glass like a tiny scientist. His parents thought maybe he would be a doctor or an accountant. One day, George found a old gramophone in the garage along with a stock of vinyl records. And that was it. Game over. He was hooked. You couldn't peel him away from that thing. When his parents asked why he loved it so much, he simply said, because it makes beautiful sounds. He already knew music was his world. Seeing how deep this passion ran, his parents bought him a proper record player and signed him for violin lessons. George was still going to school, of course. Quiet kid, smart, wore big glasses, got along with everyone. Always polite, always focused, but school wasn't a constant. Why? Because Jack family made good on his dream. He opened his own restaurant. The family started doing better financially, which meant moving. In 1975, they finally settled down, this time in Bushey, in eastern England. Jack had bought a roomy house, and George, now 12, was gearing up to start at yet another new school. And that's where the next chapter begins. 1st September 1975. Picture this, 12-year-old George, brand new school, totally unfamiliar hallways, and that awkward moment when the teacher turns to class and says, "Who's going to help the new kids settle in?" Silence. And then one hand goes up from the back row. That hand belonged to a boy named Andrew Ridgeley. The teacher paired them up. George took the seat next to him, and just like that, a life-changing friendship began. Now imagine this first exchange. George turns to his new deskmate and says, "My name is Georgios." Andrew pauses for a second and then cracks up. "That sounds like a yogurt." That's how George Michael became Yog to his best friend. And Andrew? Well, Andrew Ridgeley wasn't just any kid. He was also from an immigrant family. His roots traced back to Egypt, which gave him a naturally tanned look that stood out. But more than that, Andrew had serious main character energy. He dressed sharp, always had a crowd around him, cracked jokes in class, and had zero interest in homework. George, on the other hand, was a quiet type. Glasses, good grades, polite, a classic odd couple. The bookish Greek and the bold Egyptian. Side by side at one desk. Sounds like a setup for a sitcom, right? But this was a real life. From day one, Andrew stuck to his promise. He showed George around, introduced him to people, gave him lowdown on school's clubs. George would come home from school, dump his backpack, hop on his bike, and spend the rest of the day riding around with Andrew. And his parents, oh, they were thrilled at first. Finally, their son had a friend, someone to laugh with, to hang out. They even told George, "Hey, bring him over anytime if you're hungry." But the first time Andrew walked through the Panayotto front door, let's just say Jack and Leslie weren't exactly impressed. Andrew didn't hold back, ever. Whether at school or someone else's house, it was all the same to him. He would crack cheeky jokes, flop onto the couch like he owned the place. Yeah, not exactly what Jack and Leslie had in their mind when they pictured their son's ideal best friend. Still, George didn't care. One day he invited Andrew over again and took him straight to his room to show his possession, his record player and vinyl collection. From that moment on, the bikes were forgotten. The two of them sat for hours playing records, singing along, totally in sync. They were especially obsessed with Elton John's Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. They knew every word, every melody, and somewhere in the middle of that listening session, Andrew suddenly blurted out, "We should be famous, like Elton John." Imagine money, fans, everyone singing our songs. And just like that, A spark lit in George's eyes. He rushed to tell his parents, "Me and Andrew, we're going to be musicians. You'll see, we're going to be famous." Jack and Leslie laughed. Of course they did. What else do you do when a 12-year-old tells you that you're going to be a superstar? They called it a dream, a phase, maybe even blamed Andrew's wild imagination. But they didn't realize that this was the beginning of something real. From that day on, George and Andrew were more than best friends. They were co-dreamers, painters in a shared fantasy that, believe it or not, was about to become their reality. Every single day, George and Andrew were at it, writing songs, hunting down old instruments from who knows where, and dragging everything they found into George's garage. That dusty garage basically became their music lab. They would try to storm, bang, sing, anything that resembled music. At first, they wanted to be just like Elton John. Who wouldn't? Big glasses, bigger melodies, and even bigger dreams. But then came 1977, and with it, Saturday Night Fever. If you haven't seen it, just know this: John Travolta, disco balls, white suits, and a lot of dancing. The story was about a guy from Brooklyn who sold paint by day and owned the dance floor by night. It was slick, cool, and full of rhythm, and it exploded at the box office. 3 million budget, 237 million worldwide. Suddenly, the whole world was dancing, and George and Andrew, they were right there with it. They watched Saturday Night Fever on repeat and decided, that's it, that's the vibe, that's what we need to be. Next thing you know, these two 14-year-old British boys were showing up at discos in bell-bottoms and silky jackets, trying to channel their inner Travolta. Andrew, not bad on dance floor. George, well, let's just say rhythm wasn't his strong suit yet. I mean, just imagine, a shy kid with thick glasses, known for his violent skills, suddenly strutting into the disco in bright orange flares. The girls weren't exactly swooning, but George didn't care. He danced with all his heart, convinced he was just one spin from Stardom. And then, one night, he had a drink. Then another, and then, well, a few more, because that's what stars do, right? Unfortunately, George's big disco night ended not with a standing ovation, but with him puking all over his beloved bell-bottoms. Right there on the dance floor in front of everyone, Andrew had to drag him home. George barely able to walk, and at home, you can imagine this scene. Jack, Mr. Work hard, respect your roots, wasn't impressed. He gave George the classic "what are you doing with your life" speech. To be fair, Jack wasn't just angry, he was scared. He wanted his son to finish school, go to university, and maybe one day run the family business, their restaurant. Something stable, respectable. But George had other plans. Every time Jack tried to talk sense into him, George would say, "Dad, I can't stop. The music already in my mind. I hear it, and one day the world will hear it too." And then he would go right back to his room, close the door, put on a record and scribble down lyrics and melodies like his life depended on it, because in his mind it did. Disco fever eventually faded, along with George bell-bottoms, and a new music wave hit Britain. Ska. Fast, bouncy, full of attitude, bands like the Specials, madness and the beat were suddenly everywhere. And of course, George and Andrew weren't about to miss the moment. They formed their own ska band and called it the Executives. Pretty bold, right? The lineup included Andrew's brother and a couple of other local guys who also dreamed of fame. They wrote a few songs, recorded some demos, mostly mimicking other favorite bands, and started performing at school events and house parties. Thanks to Andrew's people skills, seriously, this guy could talk to anyone about anything. They actually got gigs. But Andrew didn't stop there. He made a proper cassette tape and sent it to record labels, real ones, with actual producers. And well, let's just say the industry wasn't blown away. At school, sure, people were dancing, they were starting to get noticed, but the record labels, not so much. Most A&R guys would play the tape, raise an eyebrow, turn it off halfway through and say things like, meh, nothing new. Some were even harsher. You two, no future. Can you imagine 14, 15 years old, hearts full of hope and being told that your dream is nonsense? But George and Andrew weren't about to give up. This wasn't the end. In fact, it was just the warm-up act. Rejection after rejection, of course, it started to wear on George. For the first time, he began to wonder, what if that was right? What if all this music thing really is just a fantasy? He was anxious, quiet, doubt crept in. Maybe he should forget the dream and focus on school, get serious, and live ordinary life. But Andrew never let up. Come on, yo, we're not giving up now. They think we're just some random kids, but we've got something. We just need to keep going. And they did. At one point, they were even performing near subway stations. Just to be heard, just to feel like musicians. But it was clear the Executives were on their last legs. One by one, the other band members dropped out until it was just George and Andrew again. Then school ended. No college, no university, just two young guys with big ideas, no backup plan, and this growing sense that the time was ticking. Andrew moved in with the girlfriend, Shirley Holliman. George stayed at home, still catching heat from Jack, who hadn't given up to the whole story with "you'll take over the restaurant one day." But the boys kept in touch. They would meet in London, go to parties, float through crowded rooms full of music and energy and possibility. And then, one night, they were at yet another party watching people complain about their jobs, their routines, their boring lives. And George said something like, "If you don't like it, why not just walk out?" And they turned that thought into a song, a cheeky, punchy rap about quitting your job, ditching the office and living it up on the streets or the wild parties instead. At first line, wham, bam. Just like that, Wham rap was born. And so was the name of their new band, Wham. Next came another banger. Still fun, still irrelevant, but this time it was an anthem for all the bachelors out there, for the guys who were single, free and loving every second of it. They called it Young Guns. Go for it. And then came something different, something deeper. On a random bus ride, George scribbled lyrics in a notebook. They were softer, more emotional and heartbreakingly honest. "I'm never gonna dance again. Guilty feet have got no rhythm." The song would become Careless Whisper. George dragged out his old tape recorder again. He and Andrew recorded all three songs, but something had changed. George had changed. He was done being the awkward kid. He went on a strict diet, dropped the weight and figured out something huge, image mattered. And if he was going to be the frontman of Wham, Panayiotou just wasn't going to cut it. So he created something new. I created a person the world could love, he would later say. A person who could make my dreams come true, and I named him George Michael. Andrew took charge on the visual side. Tight jeans, leather jackets, crisp white t-shirts. Suddenly, these two were looking like stars. Young, bold, sexy. They sent out their new tape, more Rejections. Can you believe it? Some producers even turned off Careless Whisper halfway through. Said it was boring, said it didn't work. And just when it felt like they would hit rock bottom, boom, a Hollywood-style twist. A new label had just opened in the UK, Innervision. It was a branch of the American giant CBS. Their mission? Find new artists, acts that could click with the European teens, maybe even break into the US. And who was running Innervision? A guy named Mark Dean. Here's where it gets cinematic. Andrew finds out that Mark Dean lives nearby. So what does he do? He hangs out Dean's house, literally, all day. Some say he ambushed Dean at the doorstep, handed him the tape and said, please, just give us a shot. Others say he slipped the tape into the mailbox with the phone number on it. Whichever version is true, the result is the same. Mark Dean listens to the whole tape, not just a minute, the whole thing, then he picks up his phone, he calls the boys, and he wants to meet. When George found out, he couldn't believe it. After everything, the Rejections, the subway performances, the bell-bottom disaster, someone had finally heard the music. And just like that, the dream started to look real. So here they were, finally sitting across from Mark Dean. The guy actually liked their songs, liked them. He pulled out contract and slid it across the table. Boom, a record deal. Their record deal. Andrew didn't hesitate. He reached for the pen, ready to sign it right there. But George, he froze. He looked up at Dean and said calmly, we need a little time to get through the details. You could almost hear Andrew's jaw hit the floor. He pulled George aside, whispering, are you crazy? He's handling us a deal. But George was firm. Andrew, this contract is insane. We have to be smart. When they actually sat down and read the fine print, it was brutal. They would locked in their 10 albums over 10 years. One record every single year, no breaks. From single sales, a few crumbs. Eventually, frustrated beyond belief, Dean showed up at their rehearsal space. Look, he said, either sign or stay in this hole forever. No one's going to know your name. That's tough, right? So George and Andrew walked down to local pub, sat at the small table, ordered drinks and signed. Deal done. Dean promised them global fame, and in a way, he wasn't lying. Promotion started immediately. George went all in, got his ears pierced, started wearing rings, the whole edgy pop star look. Andrew updated the wardrobe too. They were ready, kind of, because this wasn't the glitzy tour they had imagined. Dean booked them anywhere that would take them. Bars, sketchy clubs, backroom stages with the sticky floors and half-broken mics. Some nights the audience shouted at them to get off stage. Other nights no one cared at all. But George, he didn't flinch. The moment he touched the mic, the world melted away. Whether it was 10 people or 100, he gave it everything. Meanwhile, they were releasing singles on the side. First up, Wham rap. They crossed their fingers, hoped for a chart explosion, but got nothing. It didn't even break the top 100. George took it hard, really hard. He thought maybe lyrics weren't sharp enough, maybe the production was off, maybe he wasn't. Still, they had one more shot. Young Guns, catchy, fun, made for dancing, but it bombed too. Another flop. Mark Dean, he was panicking. 2 failed singles and the brand new label breathing down his neck. He was this close for dropping them. But then Dean pulled off a small miracle. He landed Wham a spot on Top of the Pops, the biggest music show on British TV. Huge audience, prime time, but this was it. Their last shot. George went full perfectionist. He practiced his moves in front of the mirror for hours, ran the routine with Andrew over and over. They even pulled in Shirley Holliman, Andrew's girlfriend, and her friend to be backup dancers. Anything to stand out. Then came the night. 1982. British living rooms lit by the glow of the TV. The hosts announced Wham. The lights blazed on, music blasted, and there they were. George Michael, center stage in a leather vest, shirtless underneath, fierce, confident, lip-syncing like a star, dancing like his life depended on it. Andrew followed, cool as ever in rolled-up sleeves and blue jeans. Shirley and her friend were dancing behind them. For 3.5 minutes, Wham owned the stage, and when it was over, the screen lit up. Wham, wham, wham. 3.5 minutes that would change everything. The next morning, everything changed. George and Andrew woke up famous, like actual rock star famous. Their performance on Top of the Pops had made a splash, and not a little one. Viewers were calling in, writing letters, demanding to see them again. And in record stores across the country, the singles were flying off the shelves. Just like that, Wham was no longer those kids who couldn't get a label to call back. They were the next big thing. George, ever the focused one, didn't let it go to his head. This is just the beginning, he told everyone. He was already thinking about the next track, the next book, the next hit. Andrew, on the other hand, he was loving every second. People recognized him on the street, girls screamed, flashbulbs popped. His head was spinning, but in the best way possible. Mark Dean, their ever-practical producer, saw an opportunity. All right, we need to give them something fresh, something hot. Enter Club Tropicana. George came up with this bright, cheeky, tropical number, a song that felt like sunshine in your ears. And where do you shoot a music video for a song like that? Ibiza, of course. In 1983, Wham flew to the legendary Pikes Hotel, which wasn't just trendy, it was iconic. Freddie Mercury threw his birthday bash there. Rock royalty like Queen and the Rolling Stones had danced in its halls, so yeah, it was the real deal. And into this scene rolled George and Andrew. In the video, they were lounging in swim trunks, sipping cocktails by the pool, trying to flirt with 2 flight attendants. Sun, shades, slow-mo smiles. They even got sunburned on the beach, for real. It was over the top, playful, and exactly what early 80s pop needed. The video caused a wave. Women across England lost their minds. These two weren't just singing about fun, they were the fun. Sure, Club Tropicana didn't hit #1, but it didn't need to. The video alone took Wham's image to a whole new level. And here's the twist. Their vibe started catching on outside the UK, especially in Los Angeles. You know, something's happening when Bret Easton starts name-dropping Wham in his books. He describes young LA kids with Wham playing in the background. It was a subtle sound. British pop had officially crossed the Atlantic. Riding that momentum, the band locked into record their debut album. Now here's the cool detail. When it came time to choose which tracks would be included in the final cut, George made a bold call. No Careless Whisper. He believed that song was something different, something bigger. It wasn't ready yet, and he didn't want it buried in the rush of a debut. Nobody's argued. The clock was ticking. They needed the album right now. So on 9th July 1983, Wham dropped their debut. Fantastic. 8 tracks, a mix of sass, energy and pure pop punch. It included Wham rap, Young Guns and of course Club Tropicana. On the cover, George and Andrew, leather jackets, bar chests and serious pop star stares. That image alone was enough to sell copies. And sell they did. Fantastic shot straight into the top of the charts. Boom! Instant hit. The band hit the road for their first real international tour. Europe, Japan, the works. Crowds screamed. Reporters couldn't keep up. It wasn't just popularity anymore. It was full-on Wham mania. And let's be honest, fame hit hard. George and Andrew were mobbed by fans. Girls followed them everywhere. There were rumors, headlines, even tabloid chaos. In Japan, Andrew caused an international scandal after reportedly sneaking out of a hotel with geishas. Meanwhile, George stumbled out of his room one morning looking like he had wrestled with a hurricane. It was loud, wild, unstoppable. But deep down, George knew this wasn't the final destination. At some point, the thought hit him. What if nobody actually cares about me? Not George's Panayotun, not the kid from Finchley with the violin, just the guy in sunglasses from Wham, the image, the brand. He started to feel like George Michael was like a costume, something he put on for the cameras. And when the lights went off, he left with someone he didn't really know anymore. That's when he began pulling away. After shows, while Andrew headed off to exclusive clubs filled with the glitter and champagne, George would vanish. He would walk the streets alone, slipping into the dingy bars where no one noticed him. No paparazzi, no screaming fans, just music, dim lights, and the space to disappear. Sometimes he would dance by himself just to feel something. If anyone recognized him, he would bolt straight back to his hotel, lock the door, and shut the world out. Fame was supposed to feel like flying. For George, it felt like more drowning. And on top of the emotional weight, there was the financial reality. Despite selling out arenas and topping charts, they were broke. Seriously, George was still living with his parents. That's when he started dropping hints in interviews, careful, clever little signals that their label, Innervision, was bleeding them dry. The fans didn't know the full story yet, but George was getting ready to tell it. Just Summers. He called George out of the blue, introduced himself as a music manager, and asked to meet. Curious, maybe a bit desperate, George agreed. At a meeting, he pointed it all out. The terrible contract, the lack of money, the sense of being trapped. Just listened and then made an offer. He and his partner, Simon Napier Bell, would manage Wham personally. Not just that, they would help George and Andrew to Innervision, to wrap their contract, start over, they promised to launch Wham not just in Europe, but in China, the United States, everywhere. And this time the money would go where it should, into George and Andrew's pockets. George told Andrew everything, and they both agreed it was time. In 1983, Wham sued Innervision. The industry lost its mind. If they lost, Wham could be over, just like that. And Mark Dean had every advantage: the signed contract, the lawyers, the backing of CBS America. He was ready to crush them. But Summers and Napier Bell played it smart. They went straight to CBS America and made a pitch. You can keep backing Dean, or you can bet on the future. The label saw the numbers, the potential, and they agreed. If Wham won the court, CBS would be waiting for them with their open arms, but they wouldn't interfere in the case. This had to be settled legally. The battle dragged for 6 months. No music, no performances, just courtrooms, paperwork, and silence. Fans didn't know what was going on. Wham had vanished from the scene. Then, in 1984, the court ruled in George and Andrew's favor. The judge said they'd been manipulated, pressured into signing something no reasonable artist ever should. The contract was void. George and Andrew walked out of that courtroom victorious, and George, he wasn't shy about it. He faced the cameras and told fans straight up, "It's done, we're back, and we've got even more music coming your way." And just like that, Wham was reborn. But this time, they were in control. 1984 turned out to be Wham's golden year. It all kicked out with a bang, "Wake Me Up Before You Go." The song wasn't just a hit, it exploded. Bright, bouncy, impossibly catchy. And then came the music video, colorful, t-shirts, big smiles, energy. It went straight to the top. Just like that, Wham was back, bigger than ever. With momentum on their side, the guys headed straight into album mode. This time they chose a quiet spot in the south of France to record, far from screaming fans and noisy tabloids, a place where George could focus, think, create. And that's exactly what he did. George buried himself into the studio, writing and producing like a man on a mission. Andrew found himself swept up in French Riviera party scene. His name kept popping up in the tabloids for all the wrong reasons. One day it was a wild night in a villa, the next a party appearance wearing nothing but suspenders. It was funny, outrageous, and very Andrew. But George saw things differently. At some point it hit him. If Wham was going to survive, or if it was growing, he had to steer the ship himself. That's when he dug up a song that he had written long ago. Something slow, soulful, and full of heartbreak. Something that didn't fit the Wham formula, but that he knew had potential. Careless Whisper. George told Andrew he wanted to release it in a solo single, but still include it in the Wham album. And here's where Andrew showed his true colors. Not just a bandmate, but as a friend. He didn't flinch, didn't get jealous. He just said, "Go for it, mate. If that's what you need to do, I've got your back." And that was that. But turning Careless Whisper into what we know today, that was no overnight process. George wanted perfection, and he was going to get it. First, he flew to the US to work with Aretha Franklin's arranger. Big names, big hopes. But when he heard the final cut, he just didn't feel it. So he auditioned 20 saxophonists, 20, until one finally played the now iconic riff exactly the way George heard it in his head. He gathered the band, recorded vocals, layered the arrangement, and fine-tuned every second. He even produced the music video himself. And on 24th July 1984, the world heard it for the first time. Careless Whisper hit #1 and stayed there. It was everywhere. Radios, TV, magazines, and suddenly people were talking about George Michael not just a part of Wham, but as a solo force. Reporters asked about the solo future, but George dodged it with a smile. Andrew and I are still working on the new album, so you'll hear it soon. And they did. In October '84, Wham released their second album, Make It Big. It had 8 tracks, starting with the sunny blast of Wake Me Up Before You Go, and ending with a slow, sensual of Careless Whisper. The album lived up to its name. It was smash, bestseller, chart topper. The band launched a massive world tour, Europe, US, even China, becoming the first Western band to perform there. After one of the US stadium shows, Elton John pulled the George aside and said, "It took me years to get here, and you did it in 2. You've got a massive future." And he was right, because George wasn't done, not even close. By the end of '84, he was already writing what would become the most iconic holiday song of all time, Last Christmas. He wrote the lyrics in just 30 minutes, read them to Andrew, who blinked, looked at him and said, "Wow, that's damn cool. No one's done anything like this before." And they were right, again. There's one song you heard every December. You can't avoid it, and honestly, would you even want to? You heard it in cafes, stores, taxis, it's everywhere. It's impossible to imagine the holiday season without the gentle beat, the bittersweet lyrics, and George Michael's voice. Back when people still watched music videos on TV, those cozy scenes and snowball fights were part of the Christmas atmosphere. But here's something surprising. When Last Christmas first came out in 1984, it didn't hit #1, because that same year something even bigger happened. Bob Geldof, lead singer of Boomtown Rats and a massive force for social change, had decided to make a charity Christmas song. But not just any song, he gathered everyone. Bono, Sting, Duran Duran, Boy George, and yes, George Michael. It was a superstar lineup. The song? Do They Know It's Christmas? Every penny earned went to help fight the devastating famine in Ethiopia. The public responded in force. The song soared straight into #1. Meanwhile, Last Christmas sat right behind it, stuck at #2. A holiday classic, aged by the global cause. But George didn't care. He was part of both songs and proud of it. Then, a year later, Bob Geldof called again. This time it wasn't about single, it was about history. Live Aid. 2 concerts, one in London, one in Philadelphia, one cause, raise money for mind relief. Every major artist on the planet was invited, and most of them said yes. George Michael got the call, and not just to sing any song. He was asked to join Elton John on stage at Wembley to perform Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me. Elton himself phoned George. "Mate," he said, "I'll be at piano, you'll do the rest. Let's blow the roof off." For George, this wasn't just a big deal, it was a full circle moment. He was now standing among the very legends he grew up listening to. But he had one request. He asked the organizers quietly, politely, "Can Andrew come with me?" The answer? Of course, Andrew can do backing vocals. When George told Andrew, the reaction was exactly what you would hope from your true friend. Sure, it stung a little, being asked to back up your bandmate instead of standing beside him as an equal, but Andrew just smiled and said, "I get it, and I'll be right there with you." Then he added, "Freddie Mercury might be going on too. Show them who's really runs the stage." No pressure, right? 13th July 1985. Madonna just lit up the US stage with Holiday. At Wembley, Queen just shaking the earth with Bohemian Rhapsody, a performance that would become legendary. And then came George Michael. He stepped onto the stage arm in arm with Andrew. The crowd exploded. Andrew took his place by the mic, and George walked to Elton John's piano. The first notes hit. The crowd went still. Then George opened his mouth, and it was magic. Wearing black sunglasses and that signature leather jacket, he sang like a stage was made just for him. Every note hit. Every word landed. And when it was over, Elton jumped up, grinning, and wrapped George in a huge hug. That moment, it wasn't just a performance, it was a passing of the torch. It later became one of the George Michael's most watched videos. People still replay it to this day. That voice, that moment, that feeling. And from that moment on, one thing was clear. Wham was nearing the end of its road. George Michael wasn't just part of the pop duo anymore. He was something bigger. In the end, everyone had been right. George and Andrew were heading in different directions, and they both knew it. George was chasing artistic growth. He wanted more than just hits and headlines. He wanted depth. Meanwhile, Andrew was drifting further than music. He got into racing, moved to Monaco, and started a new chapter as a Formula 3 driver. They could feel it. Wham had reached its final note. But instead of just disappearing, they chose to do it right, to say goodbye the way their fans deserved. They recorded one last album together, titled it The Final, and planned a massive farewell concert at Wembley Stadium. George Michael and Andrew took the stage one last time, performing all the songs that had defined their youth, from Club Tropicana to Wake Me Up Before You Go Go. They lit up the stadium with memories, smiles, and a celebration of everything Wham had stood for. It was fun, it was joyful, it was the perfect goodbye. And then it was George. In 1986, he officially launched his solo career. First order of business, a contract with Sony. The label had sky-high expectations. Hits, albums, tours. George dove headfirst into the studio, writing, producing, searching for a sound that was his and his alone. Somewhere in the middle of it all, he also recorded a duet with one of his idols, Aretha Franklin. The song was I Knew You Were Waiting For Me. It became a smash and added even more fuel to the fire ahead of his debut solo album. Released on 30th October 1987, Faith was everything George had hoped it would be, and more. 9 tracks, including Faith, Father Figure, and the bold, controversial I Want Your Sex. The album sold 1 million copies in the first week alone. The press hailed him as Elton John's heir. Faith hit #1 in the UK and the US and went platinum, then multi-platinum, then diamond. George Michael had officially arrived as a global superstar. The tour that followed was massive. 10 months of sold-out stadiums around the world, barely 2 days of rest between cities. George gave it all every night, but backstage he was crumbling. He was 24 years old, famous, rich, respected, but painfully lonely. There was no Andrew in the dressing room anymore. Just bodyguards, managers, schedules, even his closest friends were kept at arm's length. His team didn't want any more interfering. And one night it all got too heavy. George picked up the phone and called Andrew. He didn't ask for advice, he didn't try to hide it. He just said, "I'm not okay, I'm lonely, I don't know if I could keep going." Andrew listened, reassured him, told him he always there, he always would be. And when George asked if he'd come on stage with him just for a few shows, Andrew didn't hesitate. And so, during the Faith tour, for a few beautiful moments, Wham was back. The crowd went wild. 2 friends, 2 performers, side by side again, just like the old days. But when the tour finally ended, George Michael was spent, drained in every way. He had more money than he would ever imagined. Real estate, cars, luxuries of every kind. But none of it filled the void. He would visit his parents, smile, crack jokes, act like everything was fine. But as his sister later said, it was just a mask. George didn't want to worry them, so he hid his pain behind the charm. In 1990, he released his second solo album, Listen Without Prejudice. It was personal, artistic, bold, but commercially it tanked. And that's when the conflict with Sony exploded. George blamed the label, said they didn't promote the album, that they were too busy pushing other artists. Sony hit back, saying George had refused to appear in videos, refused to show his face on the album cover, and skipped out on major promotion. The relationship was fractured, and it would only get worse. But beneath the headlines and lawsuits, the truth was simple. George Michael wasn't just fighting a record label. He was fighting to be understood. The conflict with Sony, it went from quiet tension to full-on war. It all started with the leather jacket. When George shot the music video for Freedom, he asked for his iconic leather jacket, from Faith, to be burned on camera. For him, it wasn't just a visual, it was a message that version of me, it's gone. But Sony didn't see it that way. They were furious. They wanted George in the video. His face, his body, his brand. Instead, what did they get? Supermodels, Naomi Campbell, Cindy Crawford, Linda Evangelista, lip-syncing the lyrics while George stayed off-screen. To Sony's executives, it felt like sabotage. They called it nonsense, but history had other plans. That now iconic video, it was directed by a rising talent named David Fincher. Yeah, that David Fincher. The man who would go with Fight Club, Seven, The Social Network. Turns out George knew exactly what he was doing. But the tension with Sony only grew, and finally George had enough. He sued. He wanted out of the contract. He demanded control over his music, compensation for royalties, and the rights for his songs. It wasn't just personal, it was historic. If he won, every artist could follow. The music industry held its breath. George showed up in court in person. Every time he stepped out of the courtroom, flashes lit up. The press followed every word. And through it all, George stood firm. clear in his message: artists deserve control over their work. But he lost. Sony was too big, the system too locked in. George had challenged a giant, and the giant won. It was a crushing blow. Today, it's easy to forget how limited artists were back then. No Spotify, no YouTube, no way to release their music without a label. George's fight felt ahead of its time, and it was. During the trial, he didn't release new music, he didn't need the money. He said it to himself. But he still showed up in one very powerful way. 20th April 1992, Wembley Stadium, the Freddie Mercury tribute concert. The world was still reeling from Freddie's death. AIDS had taken one of the greatest voices in music, and the concert was gathering of legends. David Bowie, Elton John, Annie Lennox, Liza Minnelli, and George Michael. And when George stepped onto the stage to sing Somebody in Love, well, he didn't just sing, he soared. And if you haven't seen it, go look it up. It's not just one of George's best performances, it's one of the greatest live vocal performances ever recorded. The entire stadium was in awe. Still, the damage with Sony was irreversible. Eventually, Sony gave in and sold George's contract and his catalog to DreamWorks Records. And in 1996, George returned. He released his third solo album, Older. It didn't just mark a comeback, it marked a reinvention. The sound was mature, emotional, elegant. The first week alone outsold of any of his previous records. After years of silence, lawsuits, and personal battles, George reminded the world who he was. The hits, Jesus to a Child, the Fast Love, deep, honest, smooth. Even Tom Jones called Jesus to a Child a masterpiece. George Michael was back. But just when it seemed like things were finally stable, tragedy struck. His mother, Leslie, passed away after a long illness. George was shattered. He shut down completely, retreated into his home and disappeared from the world. He cried day and night. He couldn't write, couldn't sing. He told his team that the next album will just be a collection of old hits because he couldn't bring himself to make anything new. No one pushed back. Everyone understood. They just tried to hold space for his grief. And so in 1998, the world received, ladies and gentlemen, the best of George Michael. The greatest hits album, yes, but more than that, it was a love letter to his fans. A reminder of everything he had given us. It sold over 9 million copies, went platinum around the world. The public embraced it, embraced him, because by then it wasn't just about the music, it was about George Michael, the man we understood and who, in his way, understood us. But just as George Michael seemed to be regaining his footing, 1998 hit him with another storm, this time a very public one. In Beverly Hills, George was arrested by an undercover police officer named Marcelo Rodriguez. The charge, allegedly making inappropriate advances in a public restroom. The story hit the press like a grenade. It was everywhere. George was fined $810 and sentenced to community service. Under pressure from the press and the public, George felt forced to do something deeply personal. He came out as a gay. Not because he wanted to, but because he felt like the choice had been taken from him. He hoped it would calm the storm, that the press would move on. Instead, it got worse. Paparazzi followed him everywhere. Tabloid reporters tried bribing his friends. Everyone wanted a piece of George's private life, and it wore him down. He started hiding, traveling by taxi under different names, avoiding places where he might be recognized. Worse still, all the noise, the scandals, the grief, the lawsuits made it harder for him to write. The songs stopped coming, but in 1999, George gathered and released a new album, Songs from the Last Century. A symbolic title, a collection of covers, a quiet gesture as the world prepared to enter the new millennium. And the 2000s, they weren't easy. A new generation had taken over. Britney Spears, NSYNC, Christina Aguilera, Eminem, Destiny Child. MTV was full of youth, energy and neon flash. George, in 37, was already being called as a veteran. Imagine that. Still, he didn't want to fade quietly into legacy. He wanted to evolve. So he tried. He chased new sounds, dipped into electronic music, invested in ambitious videos. One of them, Freak, was bold, glossy, ahead of its time, and the public didn't connect. No words, no real chart success, even in the UK. It flopped. Then came an even riskier move. Shoot the Dog, a political anthem slamming Bush and Blair over the Iraq War. But again, it didn't land. The world had moved on, and fans were more interested in watching Green Day's American Idiot, and that hurt. George had always fought to stay relevant, but now he felt like he was fighting time itself. Eventually, he stopped resisting. He recorded an album called Patience and told the world, "This will be my last." Released in 2004, Patience debuted as a #1 in the UK, but the momentum didn't last. It quietly faded, selling around 4 million copies worldwide, a far cry from his earlier highs. Still, George stood by his choices. No matter how my records sell, I sincerely believe I never compromised my principles or let down the people who wanted for me. In the mid-2000s, George launched a massive world tour to mark 25 years in music. He sang his biggest hits, filling stadiums with memories and love. But alongside the music came the headlines. More arrest charges of indecent behavior, drug possession, driving under the influence. One incident even led to a 2-month sentence in a UK correctional facility. It felt like 2000s were trying to break him. And then, just when it seemed like George was slipping into the background, came one last shining moment. George Michael center stage at the closing ceremony. Dressed in black, iconic as ever, he sang Freedom, and for a few glorious minutes, everything felt right again. That performance was electric, different, alive, but after that, George slowly disappeared. He stopped making public appearances, rarely gave interviews, and when he did, it was something like carpool karaoke. Smiling, laughing, but clearly tired. Fans started to worry. Sometimes he looked puffy and swollen. Later, he appeared shockingly thin. The tabloids speculated cancer, something else, His health became a mystery. George stayed silent. Only once he spoke up quietly, "I had a bout of pneumonia," he said. And that was it. In the end, George Michael did what he had done so many times before. He disappeared. He withdrew from the spotlight, from the endless attention, from almost everywhere. His public appearances stopped altogether. He spoke less, smiled less, and the world slowly got used to not seeing him. Then came 25th December 2016. Across the Western world, people were celebrating Christmas. Friends gathered, families unwrapped gifts, and everywhere from shops to homes to cafes, Last Christmas played on repeat. A song George had written decades earlier, now woven into the very fabric of the holiday. And then quietly, a tabloid headline broke through the noise. George Michael has died. At first, no one believed it. It had to be another fake story, just another headline chasing clicks. But 30 minutes later, the impossible was confirmed. A respected British outlet reported George Michael had died of a heart failure, peacefully in his sleep on a Christmas day, in the very day he had once said to music, "The world went still." He was only 53, far too young, too sudden, too final. Fans around the world held their breath, hoping it wasn't true. But it was. And this time there was no farewell concert, no stage, no encore. When Wham ended, George made sure that there was a goodbye. But now he was gone without one. A few days later, an autopsy was performed. No conclusive results. His body was sent for further analysis. And only in March 2017, 3 months after his death, the world finally got an answer. George Michael had died of natural causes. He had been very sick in his final years, quietly, privately. His funeral took place on 29th March 2017. It was small, intimate, just the people who had truly known and loved him. He was laid to rest next to his mother in Hargate Cemetery. His tombstone bears the birth name, Georgios Kyriakos Panayotou, and below it, beloved son, brother and friend. And yet George Michael never really left. His songs are classics now. They live on across platforms, speakers and memories. In a world where music can be made on laptops and uploaded in minutes, his voice still cuts through the noise. Because he meant every note. He agonized over every lyric. He didn't just sing, he felt it. Even now, decades later, songs like Careless Whisper resurface. Just recently it went viral on TikTok, embraced by a generation that wasn't even born when it came out. A whole new wave of listeners fell in love with that unmistakable saxophone riff. George Michael didn't chase trends. He became timeless. Thank you. Good night.